So, welcome everyone, and good to see you all again. And we'll begin with the prayers. So I'll ask Stephen to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, to the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of false, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the bodhisattva, mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, so on, up to and including no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, but also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Payata Om Gate Gate Shariputra, the bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, overjoyed, highly praise that spoken by the Bhagawan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. Once in Tibetan and twice in English. Sangye Chodong Soki Dani Kapsuti I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, by the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
So I might ask John now to show us the Tonlen verse from Lama Chopa, which is a 1-page PDF. Tonlen verse. No, it's actually the separate PDF I sent. Called Tonlen Verse from the Guru Puja. That's the name of the file. I had an image of Yamantaka on it as well. It might be this third one. That's it. Wonderful. And if we scroll down to the Tibetan, because as I mentioned, Lama Zopa Rinpoche has said it's very powerful to recite the prayers in Tibetan, because the blessings of the lineage gurus flow through that like a giant river. So because of the poignancy of this verse, it's very special to do it according to the traditional chant. They can join with me while doing the meditation of Tonlen. And I thought here we can even think of Rowena, who passed away at this time last week. Our karmic responsibilities are still intact, of course, and we can offer our thanks for our friendship with Rowena and look after her in her future lives through the power of this practice by reciting these verses. So we can target it very specifically according to our need and wish. Dena Jesu Lama Tuje Chen Magudrowe Didri Dugnelkun Maludata Dalaminpa Dandagi Deje Shenlatangwai Trokunde Dang Den Pajingi Lobdena Jesun Lama Tuje Chen Magudrowe Didrodunel Kun Maludata Dalamin Padang Dagi Deje Sen Latangwa Yidrokunde Dang Tempajin Gilo Dena Jesun Lama Tuje Chen Magu Drowe Didri Dugnelkun Maludata Dalaminpa Dangdagi Degi Shenlatangwai Trokunde Dang Tempajingi Lodrokunde Dang Tempajingi Lo. So thank you. So, as I mentioned last week, we've covered the first 6 verses, which refer in the outline for this text to the general survey of the path and stages, and we're ready to embark on the second section, covering verses 8 to 48. But I've left verse 7 in a special category of its own. Some lamas included in the general section, some in the next section, but you'll see why, in a way, it's incredibly pivotal, this particular verse. And it also raises some interpretive issues, which are challenging and initially confusing, but if we do persevere to try to get to the bottom of it, it's very, very rewarding indeed. So in the Venerable Joan translation, in fact, John, I've given you a 1-page today. I sent it about an hour before the teaching, which had the translations on it. So alternative translations is called. Here we go. Verse 7. Here we go. It's alternative translation is called. Yep. So the Venerable Joan Nacelle, this is the FPMT version, reads, presently, for those circling without freedom, self-grasping is Mara's messenger. While parting from the happiness of selfishness and hedonism, we should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. So as with preceding verses, the core topic is suffering sentient beings who are being uncontrollably and repeatedly thrown into samsaric rebirths. Hence the opening line, presently for those circling without freedom. But it's also describing how, for them, self-grasping is Mara's messenger. So the word in Tibetan self-grasping, dagzin here, is also used, as we know, to describe the fundamental innate self-grasping ignorance, which according to Prasangika is clinging to an inherently existent person and inherently existent things other than person. So is that the reference in this particular case? What does it mean to say that self-grasping is Mara's messenger? As Alex Burzen's translation, if John can scroll up a little, down a little, it's the next one. It's a much more extensive translation, isn't it? I'll read it out. Uncontrollable wandering through rounds of existence is caused by our grasping at egos as real. This ignorant attitude heralds the demon of selfish concern for our welfare alone. We seek some security for our egos. We want only pleasure and shun any pain. But now we must banish all selfish compulsion and gladly take hardship for all others' sake. So, relating this back to the Venerable Joan translation, while the first Mara is self-grasping, is clearly announced, the second, the demon of selfish concern for our welfare alone, is only implicitly rendered as a Mara in that translation. However, we must nonetheless still understand it as a Mara because it is Mara's messenger and in this sense, its faithful attendant. Now, if we stroll down, John, to the paragraph at the bottom of the page, this is the official brief word commentary to this stanza that's been handed down within the tradition. So the main thing that makes all sentient beings exemplified by heroes, solitary realizers and so forth, engage in circling in the abodes of cyclic existence without working towards Buddhahood is self-cherishing. Therefore, we must act against it. Thus, there is a difference between the two, self-grasping and self-cherishing. Whereas self-cherishing itself is a Mara, its messenger is self-grasping. These two exist in the manner of a master and a servant. Through parting from both, the master, self-cherishing, and his servant, self-grasping, as well as the happiness of selfishness, the happiness of hedonism and so forth, we should not come under the influence of the desires of these two. So here we need to ask a very important question. Don't we normally present the situation the other way around, with self-cherishing arising from self-grasping ignorance? In attempting to unravel this interpretive knot, we gain a much clearer idea of not just the intent of this verse, but the intent of the entire text. So I'm going to illustrate this by referring to a number of esteemed Tibetan scholars' take on this particular verse. But before doing this, I'd just like to paraphrase it with, often, especially as an Australian, I often get accused of being not only academic, we don't have academics in Australia, but even worse than being academic is pedantic. And if you are an academic in Australia, you're bound to be pedantic. So it's kind of a heavy weight to bear, this accusation. But from a Buddhist perspective, as absolutely critical that we can apply academic skills to these situations. In fact, Guy Newland refers to this need as the need to have persistent logical analysis. And he explains this in this very important and fine book, Compassion, a Tibetan Analysis. And some of us will know this book because the entire book, can you believe it, is a commentary on the various monastic debates that occur in the monasteries, such as Sarah J. and Drapung and Gandon, on the basis of the two opening verses of Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way. And within the Tibetan syllabus, the monks study Madhyamika for 4 years, night and day. They memorize the entire text and they debate both in the morning and the afternoon. So these debates based on the memorized texts are absolutely crucial to arriving at a very, very deep understanding that can't be achieved in any other way. So Newland says, I quote, "The significance of terminological concerns should neither be exaggerated nor underestimated. On the one hand, it's a mistake to hold that certain phrasings are intrinsically correct while other variants are utterly wrong." This is applying to how we're looking at these verses. "Often," he says, "opposing scholars agree on the meaning, but disagree regarding the most accurate and helpful manner of expressing it. On the other hand, to underestimate the importance of terminological distinctions is to ignore the vast power of language to generate correct or incorrect consciousnesses in those who hear it. An apparently trivial change in phrasing may drastically alter the meaning grasped by the listener." So we could add here, so do our unexamined assumptions as to the meaning of a key term, because they can also, those presumptions can also cloud and prevent the author's intention from actually reaching us. So in other words, we must always be ready to prize away at the meaning of these words. And this is particularly an issue for us, in a English-speaking context, of course, because we're often dealing, well, we're mostly dealing with texts that have been translated. And so there's all those issues floating around. So I'm going to first discuss Geshe Nawandagi's presentation. He indicates that this verse describes how we must subjugate the self-cherishing attitude, which is essential in order to achieve the three paths. He further indicates that self-cherishing and self-grasping are the attendant and the leader of our problems. And he says, self-grasping is the internal dictator, while self-cherishing is his external attendant. So if we pictorialize this statement, self-grasping ensconced in its central position as master, cast in the tyrannical form of an internal dictator, sends out its personal emissary or servant, the demon of selfish concern for our welfare alone, thereby determining our mode of selfish intercourse with the world. But Geshe Nawandagi also indicates that in this context, and they're very key words if we're used to reading Tibetan commentaries, self-cherishing heralds the demon of self-grasping. How are we to interpret this? As just mentioned, don't we normally say that grasping at egos as real, or self-grasping, comes before and thus heralds or proclaims the presence of self-cherishing? So this is a really, really interesting issue. So we'll return to Geshe Nawandagi's presentation later. So I'm now going to briefly present Geshe Jumpa Gatso's position on the same point. He first requests us, and I'm requesting you likewise, to distinguish clearly self-cherishing from self-grasping. And he says, self-grasping is the main obstacle to achieving the liberation of hearers and solitary realizers. Self-cherishing is the main obstacle to developing bodhicitta, or the mind of enlightenment that cherishes other beings and achieving Buddhahood. Therefore, self-grasping and self-cherishing have different aspects. And those statements just made a really a gloss, aren't they, of the paragraph from the commentary which we just read out. So Geshe Jumpa then summarizes. He says, self-cherishing is likened to a master or boss, whereas self-grasping is likened to a servant or employee. And according to the Tibetan, master, the word for master just means the head of something. So the point here is now made completely clear by Geshe Jumpa. He says, before it was said self-grasping is like a demon, which is the second line in the Venerable Jones translation, which is also the one that Geshe Jumpa is using. But in this context, the main demon Mara is self-cherishing. Its messenger is self-grasping. This is because in the context of the bodhisattva's conduct, self-cherishing is more important and self-grasping less important. Why? Because others, such as hearers and solitary realizers, those who practice the Hinayana, have self-cherishing and they take care of themselves, yet they can still achieve liberation. In this sense, relative sense, self-grasping can bring about something good, whereas self-cherishing, in the sense of blocking us from enlightenment for the benefit of others, is always destructive. It can never bring a good result to anyone. It always interferes with the path. Therefore, self-cherishing is like a boss or master, and self-cherishing and self-grasping is like a messenger or servant. And then he adds, rather tantalizingly under the circumstances, perhaps it is like this, maybe yes, maybe no. So just when we thought we had the cat in the bag, so to speak, we suddenly realize we've got more wriggle room for our own interpretive approaches. Geshe Jumpa, referring to the lines, that presently those circling without freedom, for those circling without freedom, self-grasping as Mara's messenger, while parting from the happiness of selfishness and hedonism, should willingly take hardships for the welfare of others. He first indicates that the presently, which is the first word of the stanza, indicates that there refers to us, because we're presently bound within cyclic existence. However, he also indicates that there are two different ways of understanding Mara and messenger. He says, self-grasping is like the king, Mara, and self-cherishing is his close assistant, the messenger, or it could be presented the other way around. And he adds, you should also consider them to be like king and queen, where in some royal families, the queen is more important than the king, and vice versa. So those of us with feminist persuasions will be delighted to hear that possibility. In any case, the messenger needs to be seen as a Mara, he says, which in this context refers to the self-cherishing mind, but it can also refer to any adverse condition. Self-cherishing is a mind that only thinks about your own happiness and is the exact obstacle to your attainment of the other cherishing and complete enlightenment. All your problems stem from the self-cherishing mind. So Geshe Jumpa then asks aloud, is self-cherishing the cause of self-grasping? And this is a question I've asked you in the homework as well. And the answer is no. I'm giving you the answer to the homework, but you won't have to paraphrase what I've said or present your own point of view. So you'll realize with the complexity of the topic, it's still no easy feat. He says, again, you can refer to self-cherishing and self-grasping as the king and the queen, with one supporting the other, though you can't say that one is the cause of the other. This is critical. Though you can't say that one is the cause of the other, however, you can nonetheless say that if you eliminate self-grasping, you'll be free from samsara. So if you're able to eliminate self-cherishing, no more afflictions will arise, and thus no more contaminated karma will be accumulated. And then he adds, of the two, self-cherishing is the more difficult to eliminate. This is very, very interesting. So at this point, Geshe Jumpo adds that bodhisattvas still have, and this is a quote, still have a very weak form of self-cherishing until they attain the 8th bodhisattva bhumi, which is when they're completely free of self-cherishing. And as I mentioned last week, here we have to be approaching with some finesse, because he's referring to the fact that a bodhisattva up until the 8th ground could still have the seeds of self-cherishing. And they will definitely be eliminated when they enter the 8th ground, at which point they'll only have the imprints of self-cherishing, which will from that point on function as obscurations to omniscience. So for those of us who are concerned about the structure of the stage at grounds and paths, that's a very important point. Now I'm going to jump now to Geshe Thupten Chuni. He says, in general, and when you hear these words in general or in this context, you have to pick up your ears, because that's a clue that we're going to be getting a particular interpretation according to the context. He says, in general, the root of cyclic existence is the self-grasping conception, but here in the context of the mind training practices, it's referring to the self-cherishing thought, which is a source of all our problems. And as the other scholars have said, this self-cherishing attitude is what prevents us, including the hearers and solitary realizers, from achieving enlightenment. Now, I'm going to now jump to Geshe Samlo Kelsang's presentation. Geshe Samlo Kelsang offers a significant new interpretive twist. First, he says also, as have the others, that the cause of cyclic existence is self-grasping. So this is familiar territory. However, he now adds a crucial qualification, and I quote, however, these two lines are not referring to self-grasping. They are referring to any obstacles that hinder the attainment of Buddhahood. Thus, this phrase is particularly referring to self-cherishing. We're calling it self-grasping, but it's referring to self-cherishing. It is a self-cherishing that causes one to circle uncontrollably in cyclic existence. So I'm not going to elaborate too much here, but just to remember that it's because of self-cherishing that we perform afflicted actions due to the delusions, which then create contaminated karma, which then ripen as throwing karma, causing the continuation of suffering cyclic existence. So he says there is a difference between self-grasping and self-cherishing. The former is to grasp at the I, while the latter is to cherish the I more than others. The arhats have abandoned self-grasping, but not self-cherishing. Now, I'm going to jump to Geshe Doga's presentation now. Geshe Doga says, self-grasping in this context is not referring to innate self-grasping, ignorance, but to the obstacles standing in the way to enlightenment. So he's echoing very clearly the position that was just announced. So in reference to the lines in Alex Berzin's translation, I might ask John to throw up our translation of verse 7 again, if we can, the one-page PDF. Alternative translations, it was called. That's, yeah. Uncontrollable wandering through rounds of existence is caused by our grasping at egos as real. This ignorant attitude heralds the demon of selfish concern for our welfare alone. So Geshe Doga comments, here, the text points to the root cause, the self-cherishing attitude from which all sentient beings are born over and over again in cyclic existence, without the chance to reach the complete enlightenment of Buddhahood. And now Geshe Doga is most explicit. He says, in this line, quote, is caused by our grasping at egos as real, which is the second line on the screen. The phrase grasping at egos as real in this context does not refer to the wrong view of holding the conception of an inherent existent I, of grasping at an inherent existent self. So he says, rather, the grasping at egos referred to here is the self-cherishing attitude which is possessed by all beings who have not yet achieved enlightenment. And again, as the other lamas, he stresses this self-cherishing attitude is the main obstacle to us or any being to engage in actions to benefit others. So I think we're now in a position to consider a little bit more deeply the psychological structure here, because viewed in psychological terms, the attendant, by ensuring in the manner of a faithful ambassador, selfish intercourse with the world, obligingly does the work of feeding and caring for the internal dictator, grasping at the self as primary or always of chief concern. So I'm referring back here to Geshe Nawandagi's presentation. It's actually compatible if we interpret it this way. Because this grasping at the self is the very force that renders us entirely incapable of becoming enlightened for the benefit of others. In other words, it renders us incapable, utterly incapable of stepping upon the bodhisattva path or riding on the bodhisattva vehicle. And this is made clear by the second two lines, or the remaining two lines of the verse. While parting from the happiness of selfishness and hedonism, we should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. So the verse now offers firm advice in the form of an injunction. Given this grim situation, our task is to step back from the happiness of selfishness and hedonism that has dominated our attention since beginningless life, beginningless time, and now willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. This, of course, constitutes an absolute about turn for us and indicates a pathway that is exactly anathema to our former self-cherishing concerns, treasured and nurtured in the very depths of our heart, and from where it compellingly instructs us, like the leader, how to run our lives and engage with those around us, including not just humans, but animals. Even the environment, which we tend to so ruthlessly and thoughtlessly exploit for short-term gain and superficial profit, can be sort of included here. This is the extent of our self-cherishing. We'll consume even our environment for our immediate gratification. So this is very poignant. We see the remnants. I just went recently walking in Tasmania, where fortunately the Tasmanian government's a little bit better than some governments, and they've declared quite large swathes of the country as World Heritage preserves, forests. But when you see the trees in these forests, I'm sure it's like seeing the sequoias in California, you can't believe the power and majesties of these ancient trees that are often well over 1,000 years old. So it's incredibly moving to be surrounded by nature like that. But you can imagine the devastation when you're bushwalking, you turn the corner and you suddenly come upon clear fell and these tiny little radiata pines planted 1 metre apart over a whole valley with nothing else living there, and not even the single sound of a bird song. It's an absolute environmental desert. So this is the self-cherishing attitude. It, shall we say, cannibalizes everything that it comes into contact with. So This self-cherishing in its demonic, external, transactional form ensures that all of our activities will prevent us from transforming the self-cherishing attitude, which we're harboring as our most precious possession in our very core. So when we refer back to the second two lines, the firm injunction, we're asked to reverse this. And so Bersen's translation of these lines is very useful. He says, we seek some security for our own egos. We want only pleasure and shun any pain. There we go. But now we must banish all selfish compulsion and gladly take hardship for all others' sake. So by way of commentary, Geshe Doga says to this, here it's said that all our mistaken deeds and thoughts arise mainly from this self-cherishing attitude and self-grasping. All our actions are directed to fulfilling the desires of our ego and our selfish mind. So Geshe Doga now elaborates that having said all this, we now need to recollect the general difference between these two attitudes. So we've just talked about how they're working within the context of the text. But Geshe Doga says the general difference between these two attitudes is crucial to understand. Self-cherishing attitude refers to the very strong sense of ego, our selfish thoughts and concerns, whereas self-grasping is the mistaken view of the way that this I or the self exists. We need to be able to distinguish between these two because these two attitudes serve as the source of all the trouble we have in lives. And it's best to understand this based on our own experience. So this is the general presentation. And does it contradict the specific presentation we've just been describing in relation to this verse? And the answer is definitely no. And this is because, as indicated last week, we need to understand the manner of the evolution of an afflicted mind. It's this fundamental ignorance, grasping at inherent existence, that enables the proliferation or constantly elaborating conceptual minds of inappropriate attention to get underway. So last week I described inappropriate attention as kicking in after we observe and cling to the object as inherent existent. We then see the object, for example, in the case of desire, as pleasant. We've already superimposed inherent existence to that pleasant object appearing as though from its own side. But because it's appearing in that way, we now start to add on, like sticking arrows to a target, extra qualities of attractiveness. We exaggerate in an extreme way. And we know this process. You know, often we about to buy something. I've seen this in sales in sometimes shops. They have, you know, Black Friday sales and the doors open. There's already a huge crush outside the doors. Have you seen this yourselves? And people clamber, is the only word for it, to the tables, and they actually pull each other aside physically to get to the objects in order to get to the microwave. And as they're walking away, they'll be pushed so they can even fall over with their microwave and crush a baby in the process. In the bid, someone's bid to get to their own microwave. So these are sort of extreme examples. So in the moment of grabbing that microwave, for that person in that moment, that microwave is the most preciously attractive thing they ever laid their hands on, without a doubt. And to take it out of their hands is akin to peeling off layers of their flesh in terms of the amount of pain that it gives. I'll just give a quick side example. In Bendigo, which is sort of rural Victoria, a couple of days a year, they have a forest fire collection day. So people are invited to go out into the bush, we call it, with their trucks and trailers and grab any branches that are on the ground and take them home for firewood. And I've seen fights, physical fights take place over a log. People have seen the same log. They've both made their way to it at the same time. And there's this incredible tussle that's not actually humorous. It's quite can turn deadly. And I think another key example of this is driving cars, isn't it? And you're about to go into that car spot. Suddenly, it's appearing attractive because you're claimed as yours, you've superimposed mine. And then suddenly you see the car in front's reversing in and they're a little bit ahead of you. At that moment, what rises up? Incredibly intense affliction. So Chandrakirti famously says in his supplement to Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, first, I'm quoting, first with the thought, I am, they cling to a self. Then with the thought, mine, they become attached to things. Like a bucket on a water wheel, they turn without control. I bow to compassion that cares for such sentient beings. So this is Thupten Jinpa's translation of this very, very important text. He's translated Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on this text, and the book's called Illuminating the Intent. So I recommend that to everyone. So the reference in this verse is to great compassion, which is the wish to free all sentient beings from suffering. Such compassion is a prerequisite for developing bodhicitta and thus becoming a novice bodhisattva. Hence the emphasis for us. Only, and that's big, only by seeing how and why migrators suffer due to initially adhering to a self and then generating attachment to things, this is mine, can such a great compassion be born, as it deeply comprehends the fundamental source of suffering, innate self-grasping ignorance, and how it subtends all of our actions. So the real purpose of the analogy of the bucket, as Lama Tsongkhapa indicates in his commentary, is not simply to engender an understanding of how sentient beings wander in cyclic existence, but rather to show that great compassion is generated through contemplating via meditative contemplation or cultivation the way sentient beings wander without control in cyclic existence. So if we return to our current context of Wheel of Sharp Weapons, without first generating great compassion, we have no tools, no means with which to fight the Mara of self-cherishing, therefore no means to restrain its emissary ego concern, which is the driving force of selfishness, wishing to have only pleasure and enjoyment. So just to quote a few more references, Nagarjuna says, liberation arises due to karma and affliction ending. Karma and affliction arise from conceptuality. These conceptions arise from fabrication, and fabrication ceases due to emptiness. So Buddha Palata glosses this very, very key verse. In this regard, because karma and affliction are the cause of birth, liberation arises due to karma and affliction ending. Also, karma and affliction are not real, but arise from conceptuality, projection. They do not exist due to their own intrinsic reality. Afflictions arise from inappropriate conceptuality. So that's an alternative translation of inappropriate attention. And just a single, and this is really interesting to contemplate, and just as a single object may give rise to attachment in some or aversion or confusion in others, therefore the afflictions arise from conceptuality. Isn't this interesting? I can find a particular form of music the most desirable thing in the world, and it can be absolutely Abu Ghraib torture for someone else to have to listen to heavy rock for extended periods of time. This proves that it's actually arising from our own conceptual thought. Mental fabrication, says Buddha Palata, ceases through emptiness. For the mental fabrication of worldly gain and loss, and so forth, ceases due to emptiness. It stops when the intrinsic reality of things is comprehended as emptiness, and through comprehending emptiness, it ceases. So I quote this wonderful passage at length because it bears directly on how suffering sentient beings must proceed to be free from samsara. And it includes bodhisattvas, both on and not yet on the path. However, our situation, perhaps as ordinary rather than supramundane beings, is further complexified when we consider that even those who are practicing virtue, but who have not yet realized emptiness directly, still continue to create the causes for samsaric rebirth, albeit in terms of achieving happy or upper realm rebirths. But they are still technically tied and tying themselves to future samsara. Their future aggregates will definitely be afflicted. Therefore, they will definitely undergo suffering, particularly pervasive or compounding suffering, which we looked at last week. And this is why the bucket in Chandrakirti's account is continuously going up and down. We're still bound. Sometimes we're up, sometimes we're mostly down, but sometimes up. So this is why we have the full breadth of understanding of how sentient beings are suffering, even those who appear to be in incredibly happy realms, like Elon Musk, who has more private wealth than most small nations, doesn't he? Even Elon Musk. We need to generate great compassion towards them, and this requires quite a lot of work. So Lama Tsongkhapa describes great compassion as follows. We might ask, will merely having contemplated how other sentient beings are tormented by suffering and its origin in the cycle of existence induce great compassion? Or does it require some additional complementary factor? Then Lama Tsongkhapa says, the fact is, when we see an enemy suffering, far from any unbearable feeling, a sense of joy may even arise in its place. Similarly, when we encounter the suffering of someone who has neither benefited nor harmed us most of the time, we are unmoved by their plight. This happens because we lack on our part a sense of holding them dear. In contrast, when we see the suffering of those we love, close kin, we find this unbearable. In fact, the more profoundly we hold someone dear, it seems, the more intense the feeling of unbearableness. Thus, the essential point is how we need to generate a sense of endearment towards other sentient beings, a deep regard, cherishing them in our heart. So this is sort of, I think, very beautifully and vividly capturing what's required here in dealing with this demon ensconced at the very core of our being, and how it has to take the aspect of this intimate, close regard for all beings. So for those who are interested, that's from page 59 of Illumination, if you have the text there. So we're now going to move to verse 8. And I might ask John now to jump to our coloured version of the Venerable Jones translation of the entire root text, which you're using. It's one with the coloured background. Yeah. Yeah, that's the one. So we'll jump to verse 8. Thank you. So you'll be delighted to know that I'm going to say that the meaning of this is immediately clear. Presently, for those circling without freedom, self-grasping, verse 8. The sufferings of all beings who are similar in kind is being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions. In being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions should be heaped upon us, hedonists. So those of us mired in the jungle of samsara are alike in being similarly driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions. So this is a reference to karma and the afflictions, which we've just explained via Buddhapalata, Nagarjuna, and the glorious Chandrakirti, as arising, quote, from their cause, the conception of what is not real, end of quote. Also, we are alike in being dominated or mastered by the self-cherishing attitude. This has determined our sad modus operandi from beginningless time. So here we're being asked to make a direct link between our habitual behavioural attitude and our actions. The thrust of this verse is to show how we're bound to cyclic existence and unending suffering by continuously creating karmic actions. We create karma because our minds are so very familiar and well acquainted with the variety of delusions. What, though, determines that karma becomes a driving force of our actions? To a great extent, whether karma is virtuous or non-virtuous is determined by our attitude. If the attitude is very self-centered or self-cherishing, then we'll accumulate more non-virtuous or negative karmas. So even from this perspective, very pragmatic perspective, we have to begin to be very, very sensible and very clever and start carving out a space for our own actions that are less and less self-cherishing, so we can then begin to create virtuous relations with the world around us. So Geshe Dogo mentions in relation to this verse, with the self-cherishing attitude, we create negative actions and bind ourselves to cyclic existence. From our own experience, we can see that with the self-cherishing attitude, we want all the victory for ourselves and reject the thought of accepting even the smallest loss. So even if we see some advantage to win, some benefit for ourselves, we're prepared to do anything, even to cause harm to those who support us, our friends and close families. So in my preparation for tonight's talk, I found myself thinking, you'll be surprised, of Donald Trump. Here's an example of a man who's prepared to do anything, literally anything, to get his own ego permanently enshrined on the throne of his own magnificence, even at the cost of the entire democratic nation of America, the USA. Isn't it true, isn't it? Even criminality and so forth. So I don't want to get political here, but it's sort of implicitly political, isn't it, this topic? So there are other examples. Even children will even cheat their parents. Brothers and sisters will even cheat one another to get a better access to their parents' will by contesting it in court. We have examples of elder abuse, don't we? Where people steal from the frail, who may be in nursing homes, and meanwhile milk their bank accounts without them knowing because they've got their power of attorney, etc., etc., etc. So in the terms of this text, it's definite that in the end, we'll have to pay for these actions. So the kind of immediate sense of pleasure or gain that we might achieve by performing these very, very selfish actions is actually going to be betrayed by the power of karma itself. And the reason we don't see that is because we haven't stopped in our tracks to consider in any comprehensive way the faults of the self-cherishing attitude. So this is the great challenge now. We must take full responsibility for our actions and seek to change our attitude. As Geshe Sopa advises, in fact, this is how far we must go to actualize this advice. He says, we should now willingly and joyfully undertake whatever hardship is necessary to benefit others. If you strongly develop such an attitude, no difficulty will cause you to feel anger or impatience towards others. As it says in the Guru Puja, quote, "Because of compassion, I will never be discouraged, even if I must remain for an ocean of eons in the fiery hells of Avicii," the most intense hell. So in short, to boil all this down, we're required to step inside the very dynamic of the Tonlen meditation in these instances of self-cherishing. So in the very moment that self-cherishing's ripe or ripening in its most powerful form, that is the exact moment to practice Tonlen meditation. So we're going to move to verse 9 now. Thank you. John. All these verses are supporting one another. Supposing we were to dwell entangled in selfishness at that time, to counteract, at that time, note, to counteract it, we should give our happiness and pleasure to migratory beings. Likewise, when those around us mistreat us, we should be filled with contentment, thinking, this is a retribution for having distracted them. So this verse really encapsulates the two-fold flow of the Tonlen meditation of giving on the one hand and taking on the other. These are absolutely complementary activities which are actualizing the very, very essence of exchanging self for others. It gives us a very critical instruction of how to practice thought transformation in dynamic terms. So Alex Berzin's translation of this verse, I haven't got it for us here, but it's available. He says, should the impulse arise now to seek your own pleasure, we must turn it aside to please others instead. So this idea of should the impulse arise is really, really important to focus upon, because it indicates, again, in terms of experiential application of these practices, that the mere arising of an impulse of self-cherishing is the very moment to practice Tonlen meditation. So we practice Tonlen meditation when we've already generated the full-fledged self-cherishing in all its appalling form, but we also practice it in the very first inkling of the moment of wishing to reach out and take something as mine that might be better given to someone else. So this is the essence of the meaning of a counteraction, an exact oppositional force. So in this way, our main concern becomes the welfare of other beings, which is being neglected. So before, we were entangled in selfishness all the time. Now, to counteract it as it arises, we give our happiness and pleasure to migratory beings in that moment. So this is the practice of generosity, and within a bodhisattva's practice, it's the one on the path, it's the practice of the perfection of generosity. And the second two lines, likewise, when those around us mistreat us, we should be filled with contentment, thinking, this is retribution for having distracted them. So again, these lines are absolutely powerful and pungent, really. They spell out another incredibly powerful dynamic for handling a crisis situation when we're immured, we're swallowed within afflicted thought. Rather than seeking revenge, rather than seeking to rub out the opponent who's been mistreating us, we simply recognize in its place the karmic reason why this is happening to us right now. It is because of having, quote, distracted them in the past. I think this word distraction needs to be worked on a little bit, because it surely means much more than having simply taken someone's attention away by tapping them on the shoulder and making them look at something else. I think it's referring to distraction in the sense that we've violated their space or integrity in some way, such as when we abuse someone with anger or strike them, or even rape them. The operations of sexual violence along gendered lines are a case in point, surely. So I'm going to do something quite unusual here, but I've got permission from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I've thought deeply about doing this. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when I saw him privately during a recent retreat in Bendigo, the Lamp of the Path retreats that go for 1 month, I've had the fortune of doing 3 of those, asked me to talk to the other FPMT students about my own personal Tonglen practice. And I was appalled at that prospect, because you don't talk about your practice. And in my case, I can't talk about my practice because I don't have any. But it was a clear instruction, and he repeated that instruction again. And so I realized when I had an invitation to take this course that it could actually be an opportunity to, at least in passing, refer to my own practice. And I'm going to mention here an actual situation that occurred to me where I was gay bashed outside a venue in Collingwood, Melbourne, one evening. I was actually attacked at knife point at the back of the building, because a lot of gay venues have sort of surreptitious entrances, because they're vulnerable, obviously, to attack. And so they tend to hide them away. But that very hiding away of the venue creates dangers of another kind. So in this particular example, I was targeted by someone who was armed with a knife. And that knife was held to my throat with the statement, "I'm going to kill you." And I can only begin to explain or describe how that felt. It was like the whole world melted away, and I could feel the knife against here physically, and everything was thinking, this is it then, this thought, this is it. Then out of the primordial depths of I don't know where, this voice came to me and it said, "I don't want this." And as that thought arose, I leapt up into the air and span. And I can only imagine that I must have been a ninja warrior in a past lifetime, because I knocked the knife out of this chap's hand and he ran. And I stood there in total shock. I did have some superficial cuts to my arm, as it turned. I wasn't sort of taking in what was happening. It turns out I had a broken arm, because when I was spinning, I also struck his body and broke my arm. I had some knife cuts and I was in total shock. And the world hadn't come back. All I could think of was him and what had happened. And I did Tonglen meditation. Not just for him, but for everyone suffering. It sounds terribly chivalrous to say that's what I did. It's the only thing I could think of doing in that moment. And it was the most extraordinary experience of Tonglen that I've ever had, because it actually felt that I was doing it. So then it had been witnessed, this attack. The police came, an ambulance came, and I was taken away in the ambulance and so forth. But I just want to say, in reply to the counsellors who I saw afterwards, they were desperate for me to go through all the processes of the attack in order not to have post-traumatic shock syndrome, PSD. And I felt in one way inadequate that I hadn't developed post-traumatic shock. I had shock because my body was shocked, but I didn't have emotional shock in the same way. And I can only think that it's because I didn't respond to the crisis in the same way, or the aftermath of the crisis, because I've done Tonglen meditation. So I just sort of mentioned that in passing, it's a very powerful moment in my life. I wasn't the same person afterwards. If I hear footsteps behind me now, I look to see who they are. So I'm not as confident as I was, and I'm much more aware of my environment. But I just sort of, I can only share that with you, how incredibly powerful this technique is. But if I'm looking at this from a karmic point of view, from a wheel of sharp weapons point of view, I also have to say that that was the wheel of sharp weapons returning. I must have grievously hurt this man in the past, or this person in the past, as I have countless others. So may I take on all their suffering right this instant and give them all happiness right this instant. So in that way, the situation is transformed. So Geshe Doga says that even according to the Burson translation, which I quote, for even if loved ones rise up against us, we must blame our self-interest and feel it's our due. Geshe Doga glosses, here the instruction gives instructions for dealing with the people we love and support, who instead of repaying our kindness, somehow attack us or make us feel unhappy. So we all know the feeling, don't we? It's all very well to talk about these problems in the abstract, but when it's our son or daughter or partner or whoever, we can take it very, very seriously indeed. So I just want to draw out one final detail from that story of my own practice of Tonlen. I was always curious about this violent reply that I had made to the attacker, because when I span, it was a form of violence, wasn't it? And I was wondering whether that was an appropriate Buddhist response. And I asked Geshe Doga, and he said I would have been weak to have done otherwise. So I just raise this because it's a really important consideration for us as practicing Buddhists to work through these situations in a very realistic way. So I'm thinking, say you're the victim of family incest, and as we know, family incest is most often perpetrated by someone closely known to the child, if it's a child that's the victim. What does it mean to say we must forgive that person and give them all happiness and take away all their suffering in terms of processing the trauma of the incest? Are we saying that we don't have to bother with any of that because we're practicing from a Buddhist perspective? And when I raise these issues amongst my Buddhist friends, I do get replies. Oh, you don't need Western psychology. You don't need counseling. You don't need therapy. These are all a waste of time. Just practice Dharma. I think in a real way, that's true. But in pragmatic terms, it's not immediately true, because you need to be in sufficient shape to practice at all. And so I think to draw upon a panoply of support structures is really, really critical, and to take a very mature and expansive approach to these sorts of scenarios. However, deep down, our understanding should be along these karmic lines. I also remember once, you might remember too, when the earthquakes in Italy, Shirley MacLaine, your famous actress, made a statement that was their karma ripening to have been victims of the earthquake, and she was shot down in flames in the world's press. Do you remember this? As being insensitive. So again, these are your practices, but they're secret practices. You don't need to tell other people you're doing giving and taking meditation, because it can be misconstrued and misunderstood. So verse 10 now. Thank you, John. Whenever we are tormented by, verse 10, yeah. Whenever an intolerable ailment arises in our body, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us, for having inflicted harm on the bodies of migratory beings. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all ailments without exception. So the text is now falling into a familiar pattern, identifying a suffering or an ailment, and then identifying it as the wheel of sharp weapons returning for having done injurious or harmful actions in the past. So here we suffer intolerable ailments arising in our body due to having inflicted harm on the bodies of other migratory beings. Thus, whenever such bodily ailments arise, we should transform the situation by willingly taking upon ourselves all ailments without exception, and particularly in the case of our practice, all physical ailments of others in this particular case. So the emphasis is on whenever, first word of the stanza in English. This is describing the precise moment we are to practice exchanging self and others. It's not sometimes or sometimes later, one day, but not now. Whenever means each and every time, in other words. We don't negotiate nor delay. Death can come at any minute of night and day, especially if we're experiencing a fatal terminal illness or crash our car. So we often hear people say when they're faced with an intolerable physical illness, why me? Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? And this kind of thought in very significant ways can make the process of being grievously ill unbearably difficult to navigate. And if you're sort of following Kubler-Ross's sort of presentation, we'll be seeing it as a manifestation of anger, won't we? I'm angry that I'm dying and you're not. I'm jealous that you're not dying and I'm angry that I'm dying. And even in the grimmest moments, I wish it was me who wasn't dying. That even if, not that I don't want you to die, but I wouldn't care much if it was you dying, but I certainly wish it wasn't me. So this kind of retributive thought, this sort of moral bargaining, if you like, from a Buddhist perspective is actually a waste of time. And it may foment, harbour and secure in the depths of our being ways of resentment that are very, very hard to deal with, which prevent the sick person from actually coming to terms with the reality of their situation. So the great challenge for us as spiritual practitioners is to be able to turn these very moments into their opposites. So when faced with adversity, such as a physical illness or a hostile family member, referring to the verse before, we practice Tonlen. So I'm just going to quote now his, well, not just, but I shall quote His Holiness on this whole issue of how we could make the pain much harder to bear if we still have this oppositional kind of dialectic operating where we struggle with it. His Holiness says, personally, I find enormously helpful the advice given about suffering by the great Indian saint Shantideva. It is essential, he said, that when we face difficulties of whatever sort, we do not let them paralyze us. If we do, we are in the danger of being totally overwhelmed by them. Instead, using our critical facilities, we should examine the nature of the problem itself. If we find there exists the possibility we could solve it by some means or other, there is no need for anxiety. The rational thing would then be to devote all one's energy to finding that means and acting on it. If, on the other hand, we find that the nature of the problem admits no solution, there is no point worrying about it. If nothing can change the situation, worrying only makes it worse. Taken out of the context of the philosophical text in which it appears as a culmination of a series of reflections, Shantideva's approach may sound somewhat simplistic. But its beauty, His Holiness is talking here, but its beauty lies in this quality of simplicity. And no one could argue with its sheer common sense. So here we can take, the very real example of two people, both with terminal cancer, and consider how our basic attitude to our illness makes a huge difference in how we experience the illness itself. The only two difference between these two patients within this hypothetical is the attitude of each. One sees it as something to be accepted, and if possible, to use it to transform circumstances as a means of developing our inner strength. The other responds to their circumstances with fear, bitterness, and anxiety about the future. So, although in purely physical terms, there's no difference between these two in terms of their physical suffering, in fact, there is a profound difference in what they are suffering. Because in the latter case of the person who is fighting it in this sort of desperate way, they are not only experiencing the physical pain, but mental pain. The mental pain is accompanying it. They're enmeshed together in a way that makes it overwhelming and unbearable. So the great challenge for us is to think about these sorts of situations, as we're suddenly diagnosed with terminal cancer, in spiritual terms as an effective means of purifying our negative karma, while at the same time accumulating merit. So there are meditations we can do, such as Tonlen, that will achieve this rather than simply cry or bewail the pain we're undergoing. So that's very real advice. I've just got a few more minutes to go, so I'll quickly deal with verse 11. Thank you, John. Whenever suffering arises in our mind, it is definitely the sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us for having disturbed the mental continuum of others that we should willingly take upon ourselves, all their dukkha without exception. So the last line summarizes the practice of taking very, very clearly. We should willingly take upon ourselves all their dukkha without exception. Dukkha, as here, is often left untranslated because it's a more complex notion than obvious suffering. And many emerging texts, such as His Holiness and the Venerable Thupten Chodron's cycle of books for wisdom publications, refer to it as unsatisfactory experiences of cyclic existence. I think this is a very useful translation of dukkha, because it opens it out from being more than just palpable suffering to embrace all three kinds of suffering, particularly that of all pervasive compounded suffering. So His Holiness says the first truth, the truth of dukkha, consists of two factors: those in the external environment, such as our beings, our environment, tables and oceans, and those internal, such as bodies and minds. Within the latter, the feeling aggregate, the primary consciousnesses, and the mental factors that accompany them, and the cognitive faculties that cause these consciousnesses are all unsatisfactory by nature. Both the external and internal objects are true dukkha because they come into being due to polluted karma and afflictions of ordinary sentient beings. So in this verse, we're being asked to willingly take all this suffering upon ourselves. And we're not going to do this with any degree of efficacy if we're only thinking of suffering in a superficial way. In other words, we must do this within the comprehension of the reality of rebirth. In fact, we must approach this text with the reality of rebirth always in the foreground of our mind. This is because it's not just a matter of considering what we've done or haven't done in the frame of this lifetime, but what we've done or may not have done within the frame of countless past rebirths, even in other realms. So we're now going to just do in the last few minutes of the session, as a way of dedication really, a brief taking meditation together. And I'm going to describe how to do this in terms of the oral instructions. And I just want to mention here briefly, I have to be quick, when Geshe Doga presented the full Tonlen instructions, he very, very interestingly taught the first object of taking to be, guess what? Does anyone know? Ourselves. Isn't that interesting? Why would we pick ourselves as an object of taking our own suffering? Because we are also immersed in suffering cyclic existence. We're as worthy of great compassion and being held tenderly and intimately and to be protected and cared for as everyone else. This is not selfish. This is responsibility. This gets back to whether we do Western counselling or not after a violent attack. We have to look after ourselves because we're legitimately needing to have happiness and not to suffer. So the instruction, we can visualize, so we'll just do this in the context of short meditation, we visualize on the crown Lord Buddha, and we comprehend that the true cause of our suffering and pain is causing suffering to others. So now we pray to the Buddha, visualized on our crown, thinking, may all the sufferings of all other beings fall upon myself. We now visualize sending out radiant light through the nostrils that goes towards all sentient beings. And imagine that this light, when it contacts all beings, immediately relieves and completely frees them from all of their suffering. Imagine that through this giving, all other beings attain lasting happiness. Now with the inward breath, imagine we're breathing in the form of smoke or gunk, all other beings suffering, and that we're taking on all their suffering and pain. Imagine that it dissolves into our self-cherishing mind, the tyrant we were describing earlier, which is ensconced in our heart. And as it enters the self-cherishing attitude, it completely dissolves it, leaving not a single trace, not even an atom. So not only are all the sufferings of sentient beings removed and taken upon ourselves, but in heaping them upon the self-cherishing attitude, our self-cherishing attitude is itself destroyed. And in the vast, radiant open space that now appears, we send out even more intense light and take on even more intense suffering, and so forth. So we do this very gently, riding on the breath. So I'll complete the meditation there. It's said that not only is this meditation very, very effective for destroying the self-cherishing attitude, but it's also a very powerful purification method. It can purify karmas extensively. And there's the evidence of this is given in the very famous story of a Sangha, as we know. Most of us know the story, who was meditating on Maitreya Buddha for many, many, many years and had never had a vision of Maitreya. And after striving in meditation for over 12 years, a Sangha left his cave in desperation, thinking that it was a complete failure as a spiritual practitioner. And as he entered the road, he saw a she-dog covered in maggots. The maggots were consuming the dog's flesh. They were writhing in its flesh. And the Sangha felt such compassion for the dog, but he didn't know how to remove the maggots without harming them. So out of compassion, he tried to move them gently with his tongue. Suddenly, as he bent down to do this, Maitreya Buddha manifested in the place where the maggoty dog had been. So in terms of the story we're telling here, in relation to Tonlen meditation and exchanging self and others, in relation to the wheel of sharp weapons, Maitreya, through the force of great compassion in this moment, had purified the last obscurations to being able to see Maitreya Buddha directly. So there's something quite magical or miraculous in that. But looking at it from another perspective, it's almost as though we're being given here a very, very powerful spiritual technology that will definitely work if we bother to apply it. So we'll dedicate the merits. Thanks. John, have you got the prayers there? And the long life prayers. Thank you.
Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings, without exception, into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Long life prayers. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every
single benefit,
happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels. Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Tenzin Oselhita, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long.
So thank you very much. And just to mention that Stephen is conducting a discussion now. So everyone's welcome to stay for that, of course. That's part of the basic program in particular. And do give your homework to Stephen and he'll pass them on to me. As we mentioned at the very beginning, if you're not enrolling formally in the basic program, all these things are optional, although I think the discussion is always very, very valuable for everyone to do. There's no compulsion to do the homework, but if you are doing the basic program and you're going to be sitting the exam at the end, it's wise just to keep on the pulse a bit, because you'll otherwise be find it too daunting at the end. It's not aiming to knock you out of the water. It's just going to be covering some of the key points of the topic. So I'll be as friendly as we can make it. So thanks very much. It's been a delight to be here again today.
You're us.
Thank you.